Right, good evening and welcome. My name's Peter Brooks. This is the CIWEM New Zealand's first attempt at a webinar online, so please forgive any technical difficulties. We're testing our ability to get stuff done, but no, it seems to be all working well as we speak. So just to give you a bit of background on what CIWEM is, for those of you who don't know, it's a leading Royal Charter professional body dedicated to the management of the environment. The aim is to work towards a safe, sustainable world, and the mission is actually to build a global community, hence talking about what is probably the biggest issue to the globe at the moment, that's COVID-19. So professional registrations can be gained through the actual institution itself, so that's the Chartered Water and Environmental Manager, the Engineering Council for the engineers of you out there, the Society for the Environment, and the Society for going forward, so I couldn't see the slide. Going forward, we've got a program of these for the next few months, right the way through to March, talking about various subjects and activities. So today's the first one, talking about COVID-19, but as you can see from on screen, we've got a number of other interesting ones, certainly within the New Zealand context, and that's shovel-ready projects will be on the last Tuesday of August. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that, but that's the program we're looking to build on. So tonight's event is David Norman, who's Auckland Council's chief economist, has a various background in economics, both in the public and private sector, and it's my honour to introduce him now. So over to you, David.
So good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming along. It's a privilege to be here with you. This does say financial impacts of COVID-19, but I'm an economist, so I guess really I'll be talking mostly about the economic impacts, but obviously those do have direct financial impacts. My job at Auckland Council, just very briefly, is to provide objective, independent advice, and what that means is it's actually quite progressive, I think, of the organisation to have a role like this. I'm not here to wave the flag for Auckland Council or to say how awesome we are or anything like that. My job is to tell the closest to the truth that I can see of what I think is happening or where I think things are going. Most of my job is behind closed doors, providing advice to council staff and elected officials on specific policy advice or infrastructure decisions. But a part of my work, about a quarter of what I do, is what we're doing right now, where I look at pressing issues, macro issues facing our economy, and think through what the implications might be and where I think things are going. So we put out a few thought leadership pieces each year on topics of interest, and as Peter's already said, this is a pretty pressing one right now for the whole world. What I'm going to talk through very briefly is just where we've come from. Obviously, my focus is Auckland, but a lot of the things that I'll be saying are true for the rest of New Zealand, and a lot of them will be true for beyond our borders too. But I am paid to care about what's happening in Auckland, so that is going to be my primary focus. Okay, so I'll talk about where we've come from, what some of the key headline numbers are now, and then where I think we're going. Again, these are my views, not necessarily those of my colleagues, but it's important that you understand that. Okay, so let's crack on. So if I think back to the days of yesteryear that were really only 6 months ago, when we lived in a different world, the Auckland and New Zealand economies were in a really strong position in terms of developed economies globally. So we had an unemployment rate of 4%, which was the lowest they'd been since before the global financial crisis. We'd seen unemployment stabilize at that rate for about 15 months, with no signs of it being about to surge. We had nominal retail trade growing in the mid 4%. In fact, that was beginning to grow again in Auckland for reasons I'll touch on in a minute. And if you strip out inflation, that means you still had about 2.5% to 3% real growth in retail trade, which is not to be sniffed at in a developed world context. House prices were surging. So after 3 years of house prices being very flat in Auckland, they were up 11% in just 7 months. Now, of course, depending on whether you are a homeowner or looking to buy a house, that might have been good or bad news. But the reason that I care about it is from a confidence perspective, because what we saw at pretty much the same time, or very much the same time, was this chart in the bottom corner of your screen, was business confidence surged at the same time. And those things do go hand in hand. We typically see as confidence builds, people are more confident to go and make a big investment like buying a house. And so we see business confidence and consumer confidence surge as house prices go up. So there's a lot of confidence coming back into the Auckland economy. Weirdly, if you look at that chart in the bottom corner there, we had this plummeting business confidence that was not based on reality whatsoever. So what we found is that business confidence surveys in New Zealand are very strongly correlated with which party is in government. So they're quite biased in that regard. If you have a Labour government, as we do now, that'll cost you 25 to 30 points in business confidence. But even if you strip out that impact, the business confidence readings we were getting in 2018 and 2019 were completely divorced from the reality of the real world data that I've shown you here in terms of what was happening in retail, unemployment, GDP growth, and so on. And it was only in that last quarter of 2019, as you can see on that chart, that something changed and the business world basically realized the game was up. And let's have business confidence figures that actually reflect more of what reality is. They were still very low, but we did have this sudden surge upwards. So that's where we were. And then, of course, COVID hit. And so we went through a number of stages here. Firstly, the border closed to China, and then, Iran, and I think maybe South Korea at the time, can't remember. And then we and you can see what happened to our international visitor arrivals at the top of your screen there. And then we started to see the government roll out increasingly stringent standards at the border and then within the country. So self-isolation rule for foreign arrivals, that was a bit of a screw up. It was a bit naive to think everyone would follow the rules, and they soon had to tighten those significantly. Then they made the same mistake with New Zealanders and said, oh, New Zealanders will all follow the rules. And that was also a bit naive. And so we had to have sort of mandatory isolation introduced. And then, of course, we went into lockdown, as many other countries around the world have done. We had a particularly stringent lockdown. It was in the probably half a dozen strictest lockdowns in the world, according to research that Oxford University has been doing, monitoring those lockdowns. And so just, this is not rocket science. That's going to affect economic activity. When a big chunk of people can't do their jobs, that's going to massively smash your economy. And you're making a decision as a government to trade off health and literally life and death, and not overwhelming your health system against jobs. And no one wants to have to make that trade-off, but different countries made that at different points. We made it on the stricter end of the boost to health. So we were in level 4. For those of you outside New Zealand, that was effectively pretty much everything shut down for about 5 weeks, other than essential services. But a lot of businesses, of course, could operate from home. So if you're in professional services, there was suddenly a lot of frantic technology testing, and a lot of businesses got caught with their pants down where they really should have done more beforehand in terms of resilience, preparedness. But within a few weeks, desperate times, desperate measures, people managed to mostly get those kinks ironed out. Then we went down into level 3 for a couple of weeks. And the estimate is that had about a 20% impact on GDP. And then we were in level 2 for another, I think, about 5 weeks, 4.5 weeks, before we headed back into level 1, which positions New Zealand in an incredibly fortunate place relative to, well, pretty much every country in the world, bar a handful, who are in a much worse state than us right now, unfortunately. As you'd expect, though, business confidence took another giant hit. So just as it was starting to recover and more accurately reflect what was happening in the real world, this happened. And this, this is a justifiable decline in business confidence because this was bad, clearly. Okay, so what that meant was that I became one of the busiest people in New Zealand during lockdown, because suddenly everyone cared what an economist had to say about the world. And we'd already planned our annual budget as a council organisation. That had already been consulted upon, and then this unexpected event meant we had to relitigate everything. But I think this slide I've got up on the screen now is kind of one of the key points that I'll keep coming back to in my presentation, which is at the end of April, when the blue line on this chart was produced, we'd been in lockdown for a month. We'd just gone back into level 3, I think on about the 28th of April or so. And, we were trying to forecast how bad we think this would be for us. And so we said, let's assume we managed to slowly negotiate our way or navigate our way through level 3, 2, and into 1. And if we get to level 1 by the 1st of October, we had to err on the side of conservatism, of course. The blue line was what we expected in Auckland. So we expected to see GDP fall almost 12% year on year through the March 2021 quarter, before you'd see a mathematical rebound as the June quarter, the worst hit quarter because of so much economic activity being stopped, rolled out of the data. Simple maths just says that you would automatically see a bounce in your numbers. You would see a recovery because you're measuring it relative to such a weak period where so much activity was stopped. But of course, the bounce is not as strong as the decline and not as quick. But what was interesting was that when we went into level 1 as soon as the middle of June, so we've been there for about 6 weeks now, we obviously revisited the numbers, and the red line is what I've since produced, and I've updated it a couple of times since. We were now estimating that GDP will probably only fall about 7% in the year versus year to March 21. That also means your recovery won't be as sharp. So this is good news, of course, to have a smaller decline. That's fantastic news. It's still a really dismal picture, but assuming we don't have a second wave, as some other countries and trans-Tasman cousins are having, this is a much better outcome than we expected even 2 months ago. Similarly, unemployment. There was a time when I was picking unemployment to hit somewhere between 10 and 12%. We now think we will top out probably a little below, or not as bad as 8%. And by the end of next year, assuming a fair level of government support, not through direct subsidies, which are ending soon, but through other government stimulus and so on, we might see unemployment down to 6.5% by the end of next year, which is way better than 8%, but still much worse than the 4% we were at going into this. So, if we think about confidence, on the health confidence side, New Zealand has handled the health side of things better than almost any country in the world. Maybe not all through good planning. Some of it may have been good luck, but regardless, we're in a very fortunate position. And that means that most people are very confident about getting on the bus or going to their shopping centre or sending their kids back to school, coming into the office. That's not an issue for us really here. It may change if we have a relapse or someone escapes through our borders and spreads it, but at the moment that's the truth. In terms of economic confidence, of course, we're all out there revenge shopping at the moment, but there's only so much revenge shopping you can do before you run out of money. And so the question is, as that comes to an end, what happens then? Another important indicator is looking at what happens to housing. As I said, not so much about, who's making money or who's missing out on getting onto the property ladder, but it tells us so much about confidence. You can revenge shop a new car or a new sofa or a holiday to Queenstown, but you don't revenge shop $1 million house. And so that means that actually gives you a much better idea perhaps of higher level confidence. Of course, one of the big losers here, if confidence remains weak, is discretionary retail. So again, that's the new car you don't really need. You could drive the old, clapped out one for a bit longer. That's the sofa you don't really need. And it's also the travel that you don't really need if you're worried that you're going to lose your job and you might need all the financial resources you can hold on to. But I'll talk a bit more about travel in a minute. So there is a role for government in this because of not having enough time. I won't go into that in a lot of detail. Obviously, governments around the world, including New Zealand, have rolled out a lot of fiscal stimulus where the government basically pumps money in to prop things up. Interestingly, after the global financial crisis, the New Zealand government didn't do much of that, whereas that happened a lot in Europe and the US. But in many ways, that's positioned us quite well to deal with this crisis because we have incredibly low debt levels as a government compared to, basically any developed country. There's only a couple, I think, in the OECD with lower debt levels than we have. Okay, but as I said earlier, one of the main points that I'm going to keep alluding to is the fact that while things are bad, we've been very fortunate that they are turning out almost without exception to be less bad than anyone thought. Now, way back in April, when we started coming up with our first ideas of how bad we thought things would get, I was one of the least pessimistic commentators in New Zealand. So if you look at what the bank economists and others were saying around house prices and unemployment and so on, we were actually quite upbeat compared to them, even though we said things would get worse. That wasn't because I'm an optimist, as my wife constantly reminds me, but that's simply because I looked at the economic and political imperatives. There's just no way you get to lock down a democratic country for 6 to 12 months, as some commentators thought would be the case. So I wrote an email on the 1st of April, 6 days into our lockdown here, where I said, we're out of this by the end of June, because there's no, I'm going to frame that and put it up on my wall. I think it might have been my greatest piece of work. But just the political imperatives of the slaughter that would be for your economy just means that would never have been the case. And, you're seeing that in other countries now. Our friends in Australia are really battling in Victoria, and they're having to go into lockdown. I reckon you do 2 cycles of lockdown. And if that doesn't work, that's the end of lockdown, and COVID becomes part of the social fabric of your society, unfortunately. And so I just saw that would never happen. So, but here's some of the good news, or the less bad news, that we've seen over the last 6 weeks, and it's almost been universally good news. So firstly, GDP down only 1.6% in the March quarter. Now, that was 1 week of lockdown, but 1 week where a third of all economic activity couldn't happen. You do the maths, and the number should have been worse than 1.5, but that's what it was. Some people were horrified at that number. To me, that looked like a really good number. Of course, the June number will be much worse, but again, it's looking like it won't be as big a reduction as we thought, partly because we got out of lockdown as quickly as we did. House prices hit a new record in June, so a few weeks ago. This is post-COVID house shopping. Interest rates are at an all-time low. Restrictions on loan-to-value ratios that banks were required to impose to limit lending have been removed. This has provided massive stimulus to the market. It means investors and first home buyers are back in the market in massive numbers. And so you never see a house price peak in June in New Zealand. March is our strongest month. October's next. So this is crazy. Retail trade has remained remarkably strong. Sure, there's some revenge shopping in there, but there's only so long that you can argue that it's revenge shopping because we're sort of 6 to 8 weeks now since we came out of lockdown. That becomes hard to continue making that argument. So this remains strong. Here's an interesting one. That photo was me taking it outside the window, flying back from Queenstown a couple of weeks ago. Like thousands of other New Zealanders, I had an overseas trip booked that obviously didn't happen. Well, what are you going to do? You've just been cooped up in your house for weeks on end. You're desperate to get out and do something. So you're going to travel domestically. And so this is something I found really surprising. When we went to level 2, Air New Zealand said that they'd get their capacity up to between 10 and 20% on their domestic network. And I was like, you're out of your minds. It's going to be massively stronger than that. We have nowhere else to go. And so my pick was they'd be at 45% by the end of June. And when they announced their July-August schedule, it was 55% of capacity. They've since had to add extra flights, for school holidays and so on. So my pick is they'll probably be at 75% by the end of the year of domestic capacity. Now that's important because what we're seeing is while tourism really does matter to New Zealand, it is possible to overstate the role of international tourism. It is important. Please don't leave this discussion saying that I said it doesn't matter. But domestic tourism is more than half of our total tourism market pre-COVID, and now it will be even more because people are making that switch to domestic tourism, and that will help to limit the impact. From a council perspective and a development in our city perspective, building and resource consents, we expected a massive hit here, that all development activity would kind of stop. We've actually seen these hold up much more strongly than we thought. They're down, but not nearly as much as we thought. And business confidence off that very low number has actually bounced a little. Finally, job seeker growth. So that's the number of new people going out looking for jobs. It's still growing, and it will grow more when our wage subsidies end at the beginning of September. There will be another significant hit to unemployment, but the growth so far has been slower and has dramatically slowed from what it was at level 4. So in terms of international connections, this is one where I think I got it wrong, and not for reasons I'll take responsibility for. You obviously can't predict what's going to happen with the virus, or getting out of a Melbourne hotel and back onto the streets. But our view is still that borders will broadly be closed until 2021. But I would have said that by October 1st, we would have had a trusted nation open border with Australia. We should be pursuing one with Taiwan. I don't know why we're not. It's a disgrace that we don't have that open. They've handled this probably better than any other country in the world. They're a wealthy first world country that had direct flights on Air New Zealand and China Airlines to New Zealand pre-COVID, 22 million people with nowhere else to go. We would be happy to take their money, and we should be. So that's something I'd like to see pushed. And there may be one or two other countries that we could be looking to. It's absurd for us to have a mindset of it has to be Australia first, which kind of seems to be the way we're thinking about it. International students, obviously this is a big deal for Auckland in particular. We have a huge number of international students. We heard yesterday that they definitely won't be allowed back in for the remainder of this year. But I really don't know why we aren't working faster to come up with a plan to allow them in on self-funded quarantine, stick them in camper vans in Whangaparoa or somewhere like that. New Zealand-based people on this call, you know what that is. Give them a glorious 2-week summer holiday in January, February, and have them start back in March. That would actually, we would gain out of this as being one of the, being the safest English-speaking destination in the world at the moment to go and study in. And other implications for New Zealand, the America's Cup yachting race next year, due to be held in Auckland, is obviously going to be a much smaller affair than we would have hoped in terms of tourism spending, and the super yachts that normally come in for those to watch those events and then spend tens of millions in your economy getting refitted and refurbed. We're probably going to miss out on a lot of that. And then APEC, which is a year-long conference by Asia Pacific countries that has been declared a virtual event now, and so we will miss out on a lot of the tourism dollars associated with that, but also a lot of potential to sell our wares to our Asia Pacific partners, if I could put it that way. So in terms of migration and population, migration is a huge driver of Auckland's population growth. There was a time where I thought maybe we'd see stronger outflows to Australia post-COVID, given that they were handling it about this as well as we were. and they'd shut down less of their economy. They were likely to come out of this in a stronger economic position than us. That looks far less likely now. But we do have a flood of New Zealanders coming back. So COVID refugees fleeing from other countries. The question for me here is, what does that really mean for the Auckland and New Zealand economies? A lot of these people are coming back, they're fleeing. They're not coming here because they planned to come home now. They're coming because they've lost their jobs or they're scared of the health risks overseas. I mean, we're obviously happy to have them back. This is home, but they're probably not coming with a big family. They'll be coming looking for jobs, but they might be living back with mum and dad for a while till they get on their own feet. So it won't have a big stimulatory impact, but will prop up population growth. Nevertheless, with foreign migrants largely prevented from coming here, we're expecting to see weaker population growth, especially for Auckland. Housing and construction, well, the market stopped for several weeks, and our pick at the time was we'd see house prices fall 5 to 7%. Other commentators were suggesting up to 15%. We didn't think that was reasonable. Commercial property was already coming off the boil pre-COVID, so we'd had a couple of major Auckland projects come through the system. They were winding down, and the outlook wasn't for as much building activity in commercial, but of course that'll get even weaker. But we have seen this remarkable resilience in residential. So we're now picking that as wage subsidies come off and mortgage repayment holidays, the mortgages, people were allowed to postpone them for 6 months. As those come off at the end of the year, we probably still will see house prices fall a little. It'd be very surprising if this strength continued unchecked, but we're now picking a much smaller fall of 3 to 5%, seasonally adjusted, down from the April peak by the end of the year. And I'm actually thinking more the 3 side than the 5 side of that. All right, final slide. Other changes that we're seeing and that have been, in many cases, simply accelerated by COVID-19. One is infrastructure. So countries around the world, including New Zealand, are lining up huge infrastructure programs. The government here, central government, had just announced $12 billion in spending before COVID, and they've announced another $3 billion of shovel-ready projects. People talk about this as though it'll be the knight in shining armor. I don't think it will be. Partly just the practical matter of infrastructure gets promised and then it takes months or years to even get going or get the committed funding delivered so you can start paying someone to build something. And so I'm just not confident this will solve everything. It will be important, undeniably, if we spend it on the right types of infrastructure, but it won't be the savior, instantly. Logistics and industrial will continue to do well out of this. So the trend toward online shopping and so on that we had pre-COVID simply accelerated due to lockdown. That'll continue. Print media is an example of an industry that was already on the decline, and a lot of that has been worsened by COVID. COVID wasn't really the reason, if we're honest, but it was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. Supermarkets were the big winners out of lockdown. They were one of the few things that could stay open, and suddenly you kind of had to get everything there. But again, the trend towards online shopping for supermarkets and either having it delivered or click and collect, where you order it and someone assembles your order and then you go and pick it up yourself. That was massively accelerated, and I think that will stick, which is, from an environmental perspective, great. If we're doing the courier deliveries, you have one courier van with 20 people's orders. That's a better outcome. But then for councils like Auckland, but also others, we need to think what this means for the way we plan our cities. Will we need more of certain types of business land and less of other types of land? Will we need housing in different places if people are choosing now to work from home more, which I haven't mentioned on the slide, but will that mean that we don't see the rapid growth in residential living in our city centre that we've seen in recent years? Maybe people say, well, I'm only going into the office twice a week, so maybe I'll live 20 minutes further away and live in a townhouse instead of an apartment and have a bit more space. And so we might see some changes there that we will need to think about. Anyway, I've probably gone over time already. So I'll just put this slide up here. I'll take some questions, but yeah, we put out a paper sort of every about 12 papers a year. If you're interested in the sorts of things that we talk about, feel free to flick me an email, chief.economist@Auckland Council, and we'll get you added to that list. We won't spam you or just send you our sort of 3 pages we do every month or so. Cool, I will stop talking. And Peter, how are we handling questions here?
And I will just return to not the slides. So we have a couple of questions in. First one is from someone who's anonymous. What percentage of international students are left in the country?
No idea. That's an easy answer. I can say I don't know. So we know that there were some that were here who had come, but given the timing, given that our 2 biggest student markets are China and India, the timing for when COVID hit was, well, the best or the worst, depending which way you want to look at it, for the export education sector. So the fact that I think we banned arrivals from China probably the end of January or the first week or so of February. Uni starts at the beginning of March. You would have started to have some arriving, but there were a large number that did not make it here. So maybe it's good news from the sense of they didn't travel and expose themselves to risk, or perhaps us to more risk at the time. But bad news, obviously, for our universities and other education providers. But very difficult to get a sense of how many actually made it through. Sorry, I can't answer that better.
And the second one below it?
Yeah, so then there's one about, can you please talk about the economic effect the pandemic has had on Auckland Council? Yeah, absolutely. So again, as I said, I've probably never been as busy in my career as I was during lockdown, because we had to re-litigate the entire annual plan, our next year's budget that had basically been finalized, but we had to go and look at everything again. And the reason for that was lockdown had a massive impact on our revenues, okay? So things like we own shares in Auckland Airport, which obviously was massively hit by the downturn in arrivals. That's $60 million a year gone in dividends. Then many of our user pays fees that we charge for services. So things like building consent fees, resource consent fees, development contributions, which is what developers pay as a share of the cost of new infrastructure to serve a new development. Everybody's favorite tax, the regional fuel tax. If everyone's told they're not allowed to drive during lockdown, that means no one's driving, they're not buying petrol, we're not clipping the ticket. So then you had things like, the fees we charge people to use swimming pools. It's only a few dollars, but you multiply that by 20 or 30,000 visitors and suddenly it's big numbers. So all of that added up to a whole of about $500 million in terms of lost revenues. Also in there, postponement of rates. So people who lost their jobs and had a house but suddenly couldn't afford to pay their property taxes. Obviously, we wanted to come up with a policy to make that easier for them. They will still have to pay, but we have allowed them to delay payment, which means there's a cash flow impact for us. We don't have the money right now, so we have to borrow more money. And so that was about a $500 million hole. So as you can imagine, that has led to some pretty dramatic self-analysis and review here. The council is shedding hundreds of jobs of our own. We've had to postpone capital works programs that we had hoped to advance more quickly. And we've had to cut out anything that we can find that's discretionary. Some units have been, tightening their belts for a few years as it is. So this has just added another layer to that. So that's probably, yeah, so that's the impact on us. And then someone says, you touched upon working from home as creating change. What are the implications for Auckland from increased working from the regions? Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, even more basically than that. So when we got back to level 2 and we started coming into the office and we still had to social distance, we got up to about 50% occupancy. And then when we went to level 1, I said to my team, which is tiny, but we all loved, or maybe we didn't all, I loved working from home. I know a lot of people loved working from home, but we always also have a responsibility as both local and central government to give our cities and our country confidence. We need to lead. This is the time, especially, it feels like a long time ago now, 6 or 8 weeks ago, but we need to lead. And I said, for us, that means I expect us to be in the office at least 70% of the time. So, in the old days, I worked from home once a fortnight anyway. Now I might, I'm also working less because I've taken a pay cut to help us meet our budget requirements. But maybe 3 days a week I'm not in the office now, but 7 days a week we're here. Other teams have made different decisions, but it's important to me that we help give Auckland that confidence. We're open for business. We're using the buses and trains. We're in our city. We're buying sushi at lunchtime or whatever, buying coffees. But the reason that that's so important is because what we see, and I'm sure Wellington will be struggling, and perhaps Christchurch the same way, and some of the biggest cities in New Zealand, is with this shift to working from home, we're seeing a hollowing out of our city centres, places that had been vibrant and were growing rapidly, but were reliant on 3 things. Foreign students eating at the food court just downstairs here. It was just students, and now they're gone, and those businesses are all folding. Tourists, obviously, from overseas, cruise ships here in Auckland. And then thirdly, the office workers in that lunchtime traffic. And they've been hit on all 3 of those things. And so the problem with that is what you see is people don't, so when we're working from home, or even level 2, or even now working from home more, I ask people that I present to, I say, so when you were in the city centre every day, you're going down to buy your sushi at lunchtime and your coffee. Are you doing that when you work from home? No, you're not. Okay, so you're not spending that money at your local retailer. So what are you doing with that money? You're probably doing 1 or 2 things. Either you're paying off debt, so you're spending less money on takeaways, and that's going on the mortgage or whatever, or you're spending it on AliExpress or Amazon. Okay, that is not a good use of your money from a New Zealand perspective. That's an import. That's money flowing straight out of the country. So I'm quite worried about what happens to our cities as people work from home, or by extension, as you've asked in the question, even working from the regions. That might be good for the regions. They'll get maybe the rates take as a council, but will people really be spending much more, or will they be, spending on Netflix or, importing stuff from overseas? That is a genuine worry for me, and a significant number that we're probably going to miss out on as a country. So how many more can I take? 2 more questions? Okay, so there's one here. What's the time unit for the 500 lost revenue life of pandemic? No, so that's just what we have. That's the hit that we believe we'll have over the next, just over this year, just this year. So that's not even looking at the fact that, borders don't open in a meaningful way. We will continue to not get that $60 million a year dividend out of the airport. So that's just this year. Okay, so there's tons. I don't know how to pick. I've been told I've got 1 more question. Okay? 3 more. He's being generous. He's being generous. What about a bubble with the Cook Islands? Sure, why not? If they're safe and we're safe and we can guarantee each other's safety, then of course, yes is the answer. Of course, that will be fantastic for them and will offer very little to New Zealand in terms of tourism boost. Now, do you know what the age demographics of Kiwis returning to New Zealand? That's a fantastic question. The short answer is I don't have you a number I can tell you right here, because frankly, the data on that migration stuff is absolutely garbage. That's one of Stats NZ's biggest screw ups in the last few years is stopping providing that data. They claim that the new way of measuring it will be more accurate, and that's true, but you have to wait 12 months before you get good data. So that's not helpful at all. But anecdotally, our understanding is it's not retirees fleeing back to New Zealand, is it? It's working age New Zealanders who have gone overseas. They may have been, 21 and they're on the one or 2 year OE, or they may have been working there for some time. But why this is a great question is because, my understanding is they're going to overwhelmingly be working age. They're going to be coming back, probably not with a job lined up, and they're going to join the job queue. So they will kind of actually artificially boost our unemployment rate in the short term, because we will have a flood of working age people coming back who aren't here because they're pursuing an economic opportunity, but they were trying to get out of a bad situation. All right, last question. It's longer one. Would this mean that the government should look at models for local government funding more like Scandinavians, which get up to 90% of their funding from central government, not rates? This is complicated by the fact that Auckland is a unitary council, so environmental management has had an on-off funding stream, which is very hard on it. I mean, maybe. So here's what I'd start with. We know that local governments in New Zealand together, so thinking about the fact that Auckland's only about 35% of local government, but all of us together get about 7% of tax revenues in New Zealand. 93% of our taxes, of all taxes collected in New Zealand, go to central government. So we have one of the most centralized systems in the world. Yet, local government is expected to provide the overwhelming majority of basic lifeline services, things like drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, those kinds of things. So this is it's a ludicrous mismatch, and I'm not just saying that because I'm in local government. I've looked at how other governments work in Australia and other OECD countries. So that's not a recipe for success to begin with. Then you take within that the fact that there are a whole bunch of other central services typically provided by central government, where, to be honest, I feel that there's been a bit of ball dropping for at least a decade or more. So this government and the previous one, both sides of the aisle, where local governments have been left to pick up the pieces. And you see examples of this constantly at Auckland Council, where I keep saying, but why are we doing this? And the answer is because no one else is. So you take something like homelessness, and I'm just picking on that as a random example. We've got a real problem with homelessness. It's got to get resolved. It's not good for anyone involved here. Okay, so, well, what's happening about it? Nothing is the answer. So Auckland Council and staff here see that need and say, well, we've got to get stuck in. We can't leave people like this. This is inhumane. We care about people. We want to show compassion. So suddenly we're coming up with homelessness strategies and stuff. And we're doing that for all the right reasons, but that is not a local government responsibility. And I could probably give you 30 examples like that. So we're going to have to see a lot more money coming from central government if we're going to continue to deliver things that are central government responsibilities locally. We're going to have to start saying no, even though it's hard to do that. But this funding model is broken. And so what we rely on is kind of these ad hoc handouts. So, NZ upgrade, the 12 billion announced before COVID. Well, Auckland, you can get a little bit out of that. Well, if we're getting our share based on the share of taxes we pay, we would have been getting like 40% of that. Okay, I think we got 20%. Or no, that might not be true. We got 20% of the shovel-ready dollars announced. It's like, well, we're paying 40% of taxes. So, you know, you take those kinds of things. There's just no way we can meet our growth with a little occasional, okay, here's another 200 million here or there in an ad hoc manner. We need a much better way to do this. Okay, I better wrap it up. We've probably gone way over time.
No, great.
I'll hand back over to Peter. Thank you once again for the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you, David. Yeah, it's been absolutely fascinating. The phrase that will stay with me from this our pandemic and outbreak is revenge shopping. I never thought of shopping in that way, but I look at my wife and children, and that's exactly what they've done.
Yep.
And long will they continue. If you're willing, we'll try and capture all these questions. They should be on our system.
Sure.
If there are any really burning ones that we can get answered, that'd be great. So we'll probably email those out after. Your feedback on this webinar format series opportunity, if you can provide that back to the email back in London, that'd be wonderful. But we will be back doing this again at the end of August, and we're actually looking at the shovel ready projects. See what's come out of that, where it's going to go, and is that allocation of funding fair? From what you've already alluded to, it probably isn't. That's all from me. Thank you all. Thanks to the team who've supported me. It's been phenomenal, and have a great evening. Thanks a lot.